We are here for another episode of our Culture Chat. Andy and I are super thrilled to welcome Dr. Nicole Stelter. She's both a clinician working with folks on the ground every day, real stuff, but also a program strategist for mental health offerings for Blue Shield, Kaiser Permanente. The list is long. Her resume is huge. Check her out on LinkedIn. She always has something insightful to say. And we're super thrilled that she is here to join us today. But more important title is I get to call her my friend. So thank you.
I'm calling her my friend too. I'm calling her my friend.
Yeah.
Double privilege.
Yay. Good fun. So we're going to chat about accountability and how that intersects, the balance of that on overdoing it to perfectionism, maybe a little bit into victimization in the workplace, all the things. And per usual, we'll see where the conversation takes us. So this came up, Andy and I were chatting, and I was sharing some struggles that I was having with feeling like the expectations and people taking ownership wasn't quite there. And I think we see that a lot in the workplace. We think we're super clear on what the expectations are and then need people to pick up the accountability and do something with it. So what do we do when folks aren't, at the end of the day, it is like meeting expectations, meeting performance, but how do you encourage folks to be accountable?
Yeah. And it's such a hard concept. It seems like, and in the moment, it always feels like, well, you should totally pick up what I'm putting down. And yet so often there's this disconnect around what I am asking and expecting you to do, or vice versa even, and then what is actually done. I think I also find too that accountability, depending on the culture, is either a very positive thing and a positive practice and really contributes to a psychologically healthy workplace and trust and all of that, which is especially important for healthy culture. And when it's done poorly or it's done chaotically or inconsistently, is sometimes worse, right? If it's inconsistent, it can undermine a whole lot and be really kind of part of the core thread that makes your culture really negative and toxic and gets in the way of getting stuff done. I overheard a conversation of some executives the other day where the question of accountability had come up, and the response of one of the executives in the room was about being soft or being too nice, and where then that's counterproductive to accountability, or that they're mutually exclusive somehow. And I was like, wow, that is a real misunderstanding of what accountability is. Yeah, it was a little disturbing to hear it reported out that way. But and so some of it is like starting off with expectations about what does that even mean. Rachel, you and I have had conversations about races and my own kind of confusion about, okay, what's an R and what's an A and how does that, why are they different? Isn't that the same thing? Yeah. And it's interesting because we think we know, right? Or I thought I knew, and I had to really kind of swallow my embarrassment and say, you know what, I'm not sure I'm 100% clear on how we're defining this. And I think it means this. Is that what you think it means? It's not always an easy conversation, but if you can do that, then you get on that same page. We get into trouble when we assume you know what I mean, or I assume that, the other way. So those are my initial.
I also think that accountability and blame are not the same thing. And a lot of times they're used interchangeably.
Yes. Yeah, that's such a good point, Andy, because I think sometimes we use it like a cudgel, like you're accountable. We use it in a way that is either punitive or accusatory. And it's really like and you can kind of, if you listen to how people use the term and how they enforce it, practice it, that kind of thing, that really can tell you a lot about a culture.
That's right.
It can also tell you a lot about the skill set of that particular leader. And I hesitate to say competence. I'm not sure that's fair, but
fair.
Well, it is part of how it
right.
how this is, how I've been struggling a little bit, because it's like and I think some of it too was, how do you not see yourself as more accountable to the situation?
Yeah.
It's everybody else.
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
I'm just here and I'm part of this situation, but yet you have a role, and a pretty big role, in making sure this swirl and all the other stuff like doesn't happen. You are accountable to the success of this, like most of us are, but the total deflection and lack of accountability is something I just struggle with, because I thought to myself, if I were in that position, I would be like, oh my gosh, what did I do wrong? Like, oh man, I screwed this up, and all these people I've impacted around me to blah, 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 and like, that's not the right answer either, right? To have that, like, let the pendulum swing the other way. But
for sure. But I do think I think sorry, Rach, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I think part of the challenge is this, in what you're talking about, is emotional intelligence, right? You have to be able to like understand not just what other people, but like what my own role is, right? And clearly that's part of the challenge, I think, in the workplace. It goes back to what we were just saying. We were talking competence, but it really is this sort of like, am I paying attention? Am I reading the room? Where is my role? What is other folks' roles? I think emotional intelligence, it's not at a premium right now in a number of places, right? I think that That's not at a premium. I think that's where we struggle. I had a client that I worked with that she was working with other leaders. She's senior level executive working with other executives. So she's a senior, and then she's got VPs under her. And a VP said, she was talking about accountability, and the VP said, well, I don't want to yell at my folks. And it was like, help me understand the connection.
Where'd that come from?
Those aren't the same thing. So
sad? That is really, there's part of that is really sad to me, that kind of reaction.
Incredibly sad, because what it says is, you've grown up in a system where your leaders yell at you if things don't go right. There's really no kind of set of, okay, and Rachel and I talk about this a lot, a system for solving problems, right? That everybody has the same system for how we're going to solve problems. And the initial thing is, we come curious. What are the questions? Where are we at? What was the outcome? Was that the outcome we wanted? What do we think went wrong in the process? Instead, leaders are banging on desks. I just got off the phone with an angry customer, and it starts this whole process where now I'm in defense mode. I'm certainly, to Rachel, to your point, I'm certainly not raising my hand saying, it was me. I should have done this differently. I should have done that differently. You sort of sit back and you shut up. Then you put the super deflectors on, like, look at him over there. Look at them over there. It starts the whole process. So I think it really does start with leadership. It does start with leaders understanding what accountability means. It starts at the level of emotional intelligence on your whole entire, within your whole entire team. And I think that's sort of where we have all the problems of, like, we really can't ever get anything done. We're wondering why we're constantly sort of in this spin.
Well, I want to go back to what you were saying, Nicole, too, about having the conversation, making the assumptions, right? And the biggest thing we try and work with folks on is building that culture that you can have the conversation, that you can ask the question, that you can say, I'm assuming this means X. Is that what you're thinking too? Slowing down to then go fast.
Yes.
But if we don't take that time up front,
you don't have to do it
like
over and over. Yeah. That's the thing. I think sometimes it's like, I don't have time to do that, or you should know what I mean, or that kind of thing. I mean, I've done a lot of couples counseling in my practice, and that whole thing, well, you should know what I mean, it makes me want to poke my therapist eyeballs out, but at the same time, and it happens in the workplace too, right? Like, you should know, totally. You're a SME here, or you're a director here, or whatever it is. Like, and I think some of it is like tolerating the discomfort of that conversation. And you mentioned EQ, Andy. I think you're spot on about that. Tolerating the conversation to work through a disconnect, and what might be the frustration of having to slow down. And if you're not a naturally patient person, or it's hard to articulate your thinking, I mean, those are hard things, and it's uncomfortable. And sometimes the frustration of that is, and then the fear of getting in trouble if you work in a workplace that is toxic in that way. It's just like, you know what, I just want to move on, and you're just going to get in trouble from me if you don't, read my mind, essentially. And it really stops us from doing our best work, I think.
Well, and what's interesting is you're going to pay. We talk about this a lot. Like, you're going to pay on the front or you're going to pay on the back. When you invest in the front, it's a lot less resource, from a resource perspective, expensive than paying on the front. Than paying on the back. Yeah. So the idea that we're getting clarity around what is everyone's roles. Wait, explain to me if I'm an R versus an A. What is it I have to do as an R versus an A? If we don't even create an environment where you can do that, how do you even get to a good place?
Yeah, it's hard. I have a long career, and it's hard to tell because I look so young and spry, and I've been in a number of areas. I have a PhD in organizational psychology. I've grown my own business. I should know what responsible and accountable means. And so the idea, and I remember having this conversation actually with you, Rachel, like this is, a long time ago now, but like, oh God, okay, I'm going to sound so stupid right now, but I need to force myself to be uncomfortable, take the risk of asking this question. I don't know how this person is going to react, and that's okay. I have to be the one willing to take the first step and do that. And I think, the other part of that is of psychologically healthy workplace and culture is that if you're doing that also in front of people, and the leader in that moment takes that opportunity to demonstrate a healthy conversation and getting to clarity and understanding, man, that pays dividends. That pays major dividends, because if the people around see that happen in that interaction, then they're going to be 100 times more willing to tolerate their own discomfort and step into that risk space. It's huge.
It's precisely why when coaching leaders, and it's like, okay, when an issue arrives, the first question needs to be around what I as the leader what could I have done differently? What role could I have played to support, to just create the space in the room for other people to feel comfortable to ask that same question of themselves, right? So you're spot on where it has to start with the leader. It has to start with the leader not looking outwards, but really sort of the self-reflection of, Rachel, I think your example is this, right? If I'm sort of over a thing and it's gone sideways, I really do have to ask, even if I'm not in the day-to-day of the work, where did I fail you all? Because I'm the leader here, right? I'm the one who should be... Right. Yeah. I'm the one who's supposed to be removing barriers, making sure that you don't have challenges, like helping and supporting to get this project or whatever it is to the finish line. So you have to be able to ask that question. But I think you're so spot on, Nicole, is that it sets up such a good environment. If you as the leader can just say those things, it's not going to diminish who you are as a leader. People are not going to think that you're a bad leader. It's quite the reverse, right? You are going to get more support. You're going to get more engagement. You're going to get an understanding of your problems and issues and challenges and the like.
My dissertation was on specifically minority and women's leadership development. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason for that was, and the premise of it was also applying feminist research methodology to leadership development, being that so much of the way we look at leadership development and leadership training has so forever been based on these very kind of structured, from early on, like military infrastructure and techniques and that kind of training methodology and mindset, which is then also very kind of white and male based. And one of the things that I talked a lot about in my dissertation, but especially in the subject interviews that I did, was how these kinds of interactions are really, although maybe natural to some people, also not necessarily frowned upon, but really kind of anathema to what everybody expects from a leader. Like, what does a leader look like? Leader doesn't look like having those conversations, right?
Ask
I think
the
that's
question.
changing. Yeah, I think all
Showing
that's really
vulnerability.
changing.
That's
Yeah,
big.
exactly. All, no
Yeah.
goes, right? And at the same time, we know that we know now, and I think there's more and more talk about how that is not, that actually doesn't work as well as we, that kind of command and control approach where there isn't vulnerability, there isn't being curious, there isn't what role did I play in this failure? It's like, who's to blame for it? And I think that's where the misunderstandings around accountability and how to practice that really come into play. It's almost like it's like a practice that needs to be rebranded in a way.
Yeah.
Because it's become really kind of, I don't know.
Well, and it is the conversation. All right. So like Andy and I are both big process people. You brought up the RACI, like that's a lovely tool that I use all the time. Right. But it's a tool. And to your point, like everybody has a different experience and understanding of how that worked. Like, I get into conversations with people about rate and even those things, like there's different definitions. I'm like, it's not an action item, like whatever, but all the, so we need part of the process needs to be having the conversation on how we use a tool, right? They're just tools, but how we're going to use them has to be part of that process, and saying like, well, over here, I used it like this. Is this how we're all going to agree? What are our common norms of how we approach things? So it can still be part of that process to have the conversation that might be uncomfortable for folks, but it does seem like, again, you put the process word into it and we're going to have a dialogue about this, that, the other. It brings that fear of whether it's showing vulnerability or uncertainty down a little bit. Yeah. But we do have to have that part of the process. Don't just throw a tool. Like, this is the tool we're going to use.
I think the other part of the process piece that is important is also you could really, you could screw up in this conversation too. And that's the cool part of process too for accountability is, again, you're watching, if I'm having a conversation with one of my team and I'm really struggling, I'm screwing up the conversation. And me kind of tolerating the discomfort of okay, this is not going well. And what do I need to do differently here? Right. And them watching, so you don't have to do it perfect every time. You can completely screw it up. And
I think that's part of humility too, right?
Yes.
Like now we're humble. That's the emotional intelligence piece too, right? Yeah. That we can be self-aware and self-reflect and say, okay, I'm not doing this well, and be comfortable with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the hard part, because I know, for me, where I struggle in the emotional intelligence space is it's not that I'm not aware, it's that I don't necessarily regulate that very well. Right? Like some of it's like I'm very vulnerable and let it all hang out. That's not always comfortable for folks, and not the right thing to read the room. Right. So, there's self-awareness is key, but then there's also what do you
regulating
do with that,
Yeah, that's actually a really good call out, because a lot of people, I think you're right, that it's sometimes the awareness is not easy, but then it's not the end all of EQ. It's the regulating what comes up with that awareness. And
you're like, what? I'm just being my authentic self.
Oh.
But this thing about having some humility.
Yeah.
Well, and I think this is such a big thing, because in today's culture, we seem to excuse rudeness, a complete inability to care about other people's feelings by inserting the word authentic or this is what is the statement? My brain's so bad when it's like, I'm just telling my story, or I'm telling my truth. It's my truth. And it's like, okay, that's a thing for real. And we don't want people not telling their truths, but also you exist in a community
where almost narcissistic. I use that term in a way I probably shouldn't, but it's a very under-evolved perception of
what that means, right?
Egocentric, perfect. That's the right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're right. I agree, Andy. It's used in a very kind of, excuse way.
Weaponized.
Yes, it's weaponized. That's exactly it. It's weaponized. Yeah.
Yeah. I can do this because I'm just being, authentic, and yeah. It's like,
but back to that emotional intelligence, that's one of the components, right? Read the room, self-aware.
That's right.
Yeah, but I think a piece of this too is the humility, right? So when I'm thinking of accountability and that self-awareness of what part did I play in that, to just have some humility to say, like, I'm not perfect, and that's okay. But not let it go down the rabbit hole that I seem to go down, which is like, oh my God, everything's my fault. Like, how bad did I mess this up? Blah, 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 flog. Like, that's not the answer either.
Yeah.
Because we do live in a ecosystem of stuff that happens in the workplace, right? It's usually never one person, but there is some piece of that process where you go, okay, where did I misstep, or what could I have done better? And I think when you let people know that and like go, oh yeah, that didn't go well, I see how this started, and maybe I could have course corrected at this moment, or maybe I could have. People are way more eager to rally around that, right? You're like, oh cool, yeah, you're vulnerable, you're self-aware, you see your piece. Whereas if you're just going like everybody else, I'm a victim to this situation, I personally don't have too much patience for that. Like, I'm not down for that. Mainly because I put a higher value on self-awareness, but it's
the pointing fingers, blaming, deflection thing is, for me personally, is a trigger in a way that I have to be careful how I respond when I see that happening. And I think it was such an indicator of kind of fear and a lot of not great things that you can also have compassion for. And in a work environment, I appreciate that you have these feelings about what's going on, and we need to make a pivot. How are we going to do this differently? And sometimes those conversations are very difficult, because there are sometimes people on a team who just cannot tolerate the anxiety of ownership and what they're doing with it, how they're interpreting it, to the extent that they will never hold themselves accountable, take responsibility. And, those aren't good. That's not a good fit.
I mean, is that what we think might be the differentiator in a leader?
Well, the question I was going to ask that, Nicole, as you were talking, the question that started to come in my head was, okay, is this individual based? Is this just a person who kind of is never going to do this, or is this created because of an environment? Yeah, are we in a culture?
I think it's both and, right? I think, for me, I feel like I know it's more cultural the more people I see doing similar behaviors.
Right.
And then not that they don't have a personal responsibility for their behavior, right? It's not an either or, black or white thing, but the levers are being pulled harder on the culture side, organizational culture side, the more people you kind of see exhibit this behavior. If the outlier is the person who is, taking responsibility and holding, practicing healthy accountability, that's not a good sign. And where you have the outlier kind of reverse, where you have maybe one or two people who are kind of acting without accountability or even reinforcing each other, sometimes you can have that too, right? A small group of people or a small team that's doing that, that's more about that kind of dynamic in that system, or maybe with that particular manager, or if it's one employee, I think that's a harder, for me, in my different work and leadership roles, that's harder when it's the single kind of unique or individual who's going, who's acting that way, or who can't quite tolerate, the discomfort of ownership. So
I mean, I can see it on both sides, because I can easily see if it's one person, they're not a fit for this culture, because this is if the culture is one that wants to be open and wants
Yeah,
this,
happen.
this type of behavior. And I can see it from the other side too, where it's so difficult when it's like, hey, CEO, you are part of the problem here, man.
Yeah.
Like, you are not creating an environment where people will raise their hands. And I worked for an organization, and it was really a beautiful thing. You could see sort of this transition as, senior level, executive level leadership started to change how they were asking questions, right? Started to look to say things like, we saw this problem here, here's the support we're going to give. You could start to see this shift of where people were like, oh, I got that. Oh, that happened in my area. Okay, let me go take that. And it stopped being a conflict, right? So all this really does, I mean, I think we keep circling around the same thing here. The theme is leaders and how they perform, and they will be, I think similar to, you hear this a lot in sports as a reference, like the team is indicative of the coach. They take on the coach's behavior, right? And I think the same is true in the workplace. I did want to, because I think it's really interesting because we've talked a lot about the people who don't want to take accountability, and we sort of, Rachel, you kind of referenced this, like, it's all my fault, I did it wrong, I was wrong, and the complete other end of the spectrum. And Nicole, I'd love to get your perspective on that, because Rachel and I actually mentioned the word martyrdom. And I probably was triggered. I was like, I'm not trying to be a martyr. I just want to do a good job, like that kind of a thing. But I do think that there is sort of that sense too. Like, I'm going to make you feel so bad because I'm going to take all the blame in sort of, that type of mentality. So I'd love to hear your position on that, or your point of view.
Yeah. So those are two different answers or questions in there too. One is about kind of hyper accountability, right? To the extent that it is about kind of, sometimes that's about control. I feel most comfortable if I'm, raising my hand for everything, even though that may not be realistic. Some of that I think can just be really kind of perfectionism, and, the anxiety of wanting to do a good job. I mean, there's a lot of good in that too, right? Because people usually, they don't want to do a crappy job. People want to do a good job,
right?
Regardless. And sometimes we do kind of get too far into the kind of, like I said, hyper accountability, and you have to really kind of help somebody tease that apart. What is that about? And also recognizing that in your desire to do a good job and control, you're actually maybe undermining what can get done. And so it's counterintuitive, and it is hard to kind of work through the anxiety of what that means sometimes.
Yeah.
The martyrdom thing is really tough. Because
do you see
that
it?
is, oh
do you
God.
see that?
Yeah. And it's not, to be honest, I see it, but I think what's hard is when it's really subtle, because there's a really open kind of martyrdom practice that, where somebody is just very loudly needing that victim role. And it's kind of like ham-handed enough that everybody is aware, and it's like, it's just kind of something that hopefully people kind of bracket and work with or around. And that's somebody who, again, I think there's probably a lot going on there. I think when it's subtle is much more difficult to work with. And if it's somebody who is in a key role, there's such a lack of self-awareness in that, in what you're needing from work, what you're getting from work, and how you're going about it. There's something that person is trying to get from the work that they do, and it's not working. And if there's a lack of awareness for what I get from my work, how I attach to it, what it means to me, I'm not going to be able to see how I'm screwing that up in that kind of martyrdom behavior. And it's also really there's a lot of shame in it. And so, which is incredibly sensitive for people to address, whether it's in the workplace or in a relationship or just, wherever. And usually in a workplace, it's just really hard to find people who have the skill set to have that kind of conversation with someone, because that really requires a lot of trust to deep dive into that kind of shame-based behavior. It's not something I see like a whole lot of that is like super bald-faced. I think in my experience, the more kind of hierarchical cultures or organizations, I feel like that's where I think I've seen it more, because in hierarchy, there's this perceived, I have less power and control, because it's like the scaffolding is stiffer in a way. And so I have less direct kind of power and control in that environment. And if I then also perceive or have a sense of myself that is about shame and anxiety and perfectionism, the backdoor way of going about asserting control is through martyrdom. And so I think that's partially where it kind of manifests more.
I think it's odd because it has the same kind of impact on the cult, right? Whether you're to the extreme on either end, it's negatively impacting the culture a lot in the same way.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's hard because, again, people are not trying to do a bad job. And oftentimes when they're, not aware enough of their own kind of approach and behavior and the impact of it, there's just a big disconnect there. And usually the disconnect is fueled by something that's probably pretty painful for them individually. And those are just not conversations people have at work. Yeah.
No, it's such a
well,
great
other
point.
People don't. We seem to.
Right. I know, on a podcast even. But
it's our job to do that.
But see, that's what coaching is great for. That's what, yes, therapy, even though it's not a clinical issue, but the coaching is great for that. But then also support. Like if you have trusted people who are going to pull you aside and be like, okay, Nicole, hey, I just need to let you know how you're coming across, and I trust you, and vice versa. And so you don't have to be perfect, and you don't have to be working in a perfect culture. You have your people, your tribe. That's a really important, an important kind of inoculator to some of this.
What an excellent point, because Rachel and I will talk a lot about you lead from where you sit. And a lot of times we will say things like, well, we can't do this because X leaders like that, or we can't do this because X leaders like this. And I think you just made such an amazing point about what is your tribe, who is your support system. And we know this from, employee engagement scores, which when I first started hearing about this idea of, do you have a friend at work? Because, I grew up under the guise of like, your friends aren't at work. Your friends are like wherever else they're at. Like, this is work. Come to work, Right. But you start to realize, because you guys can actually be a support system, both to call out things. Hey, this is what this looked like. I'm not sure if that's what you're trying to represent, that sort of creating that psychologically safe environment. And so what a great way to combat, I think, maybe sometimes if there's a macro poor culture, where can you find your places? Who are the people who can be your tribe to help ensure that you're not contributing to the bad culture, and where you guys might be able to band together to help support shifting the culture a bit? Yeah.
And it can't be, I think the expectation can't be that all conversations and offerings of support are going to be comfortable.
Right.
Or easy to ingest and hear. And again, that's where if I have trust with you, I'm okay to look really fallible and human and vulnerable and all kinds of things that are uncomfortable. And it's a big ask. That is a high level human ask for people to do, and then to do consistently day in and day out with pressures that are on leaders that come from all different directions. And that's just at work, right? We're not even talking about, the environment at home and just, social political. So it's a lot. And if you don't have the people around you who can kind of prop you up and also help you contain, the parts of you that you're trying to work, you're working with, and you don't trust them with that. It's really, I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't think it's realistic to expect people to do that.
Well, that's why we talk about feedback like all the time, two-way feedback, right? So it's not just about giving feedback, that come through our programs. It's like, oh, I need to get better at giving feedback. I need to get better at giving feedback. So actually, the best way to get better at giving feedback is to ask for feedback. Because then you have that trust, right? Now we're building a relationship. Now we have trust. And you need your folks to be able to do that, Yeah. But this thing on account. Oh yeah.
No, sorry. No, I just wanted to add one thing to this because I think I think this idea, and this is probably, we could probably have a whole discussion about this, is this feeling, this idea of being uncomfortable, and the thought that we should never, God forbid, should we ever have to be uncomfortable.
Yeah. And you sweat.
Or that it's an indicator that something's wrong, right? Yeah. Versus like, no, it's just discomfort. We do a lot of that. We assign like discomfort, this really, or distress, this like horrible, even in the clinical space, right? We look for, we got to find a therapist because I have grief because I lost somebody close to me. No, that's not a mental illness. You have, it's
supposed to. You're supposed to feel something.
But we do that. We like these like unpleasant feelings with, like, this must indicate something wrong with me or the situation or my work or, something. And we have it. You have to.
Instead of it being a propeller, right? Distress and discomfort are great things because now something needs to change. Now we need growth. Now we need, progression.
But we know it, right? Because when, and I think I would say most common where you could apply an analogy for this is exercise. If you're just walking at your slow pace every single day at your whatever the pace is, there really is no way to get you to the next phase, whether that is stronger, leaner, whatever the thing is, right? Even healthier. We have to take that 30-second sprint up that hill and feel what that feels like, right? So I think, and again, I think this is such a broader conversation, but I think we culturally, certainly here in the United States, there's probably a host of other countries that are like this as well. It's just like from the time, I feel like post 80s children, it's like when you used to lose and not get a participation award, when you used to have to overcome stuff, you fall down, you scrape your knees, and you got to get up and wipe it off and keep going. This is
resilience.
Watch how this comes full circle. We are lacking such a level of resilience that we just want to candy coat everything. And I think you can probably look at the drug issue as part of that. I think, you can sort of start to cycle all of this stuff together, that we really have to get to a space where it's okay to be uncomfortable, knowing that there's opportunities then that we're going to get through this. You're going to be sad because someone passed away. You're going to be sad because you lost a job. You're going to be sad because you didn't get the job that you wanted. The boyfriend broke up with you, whatever. That's real. It's real life. You're not supposed to walk around here every day with it's not supposed to be that way. Right. But we're conditioned to say, of course you are. Don't show any emotion. You're not supposed to cry. There's no crying in baseball, there's, it's kind of that kind of thing.
Well, good fun. I'm learning a lot. And, I think when just going back to this idea of accountability, like everything, it's not a yes, a no. It's a spectrum, right? It's finding that balance. And where that starts is self-awareness, being humble, finding that balance, and having people who can hold up the mirror and say hey, this is the response that you're getting here, and being okay, having that environment where it's okay to ask yourself, what could I have done differently here? And that's not a bad thing.
And I think Nicole said this too. And this is one of our favorite things, is just enter it curious. Keep your mood elevator at curious. It doesn't say that it has to be your fault or that you have to find something that makes it your accountability, but at least be curious about it. Don't start with the levels of deflection or it's all my fault. Let's just be at a moderate place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And on the days or in the moments when and this is where EQ comes in, right? And being self-aware, on the days when I feel like I cannot start with curiosity, then I know that's a day or a situation or a relation, whatever it is. I know I need to be aware of that and take a different approach, or maybe even pump the brakes and be like, I'll get back to you after.
Yeah, today's not the day.
That's right. Yeah. Today's not the day for that conversation.
Because that's just reality too, right? I mean, if you're doing that all the time, then that's a different, something else going on you want to look at.
There's a mood changer.
But
that's right. That's right.
But that's something that you have to have in your toolbox too. And again, like your teammates and your colleagues watching you do that, like saying when not right now is the right choice. That's good leadership.
Powerful.
Mm-hmm. So
love it.
Yeah. Sometimes you're going to ask your colleagues, can I ask a question? And they're going to say no. And you can't be offended by that. You just have to say, it's not the day. I'm going to come back tomorrow and I'll ask that question.
Not the day.
Today is the day.
Good stuff. Well, Nicole, thank you so much for joining us and persevering and being resilient.
Thank you for staring at my ceiling from the, sorry about the video stuff. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much to both of you. It's really, really grateful for the time. This has been a really great conversation. Very interesting stuff. So
awesome. Well, thank you.
Come back. Come chat with us.
I'd love to.
Thank you for being the wonderful leader and wonderful human in the workplace that you are, because I've experienced that firsthand and it pays dividends. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, you guys. Thanks for doing what you're doing.
See you later. Until next time. See you later. Bye.
Bye.